This film explains disassembly of the Z1 engine after it has been removed from the frame and mounted in a work stand. Remove the tachometer drive gear. Take off the valve cover. Take out the chain guide sprocket assembly. Unbolt the 4 camshaft caps. The caps are marked as to location on the head. Be careful when handling these caps as they are machined as a part of the cylinder head and will not be available separately. Remove the bushing halves and either mark them as to location or arrange them in order, since they must be put back in their original positions if they are to be reused. Remove the camshafts. Take out the 4 spark plugs. Pull off the head. Head disassembly is covered in the engine maintenance tape and so will not be shown here. Be sure to mark all the lifters and shims so they can be returned to the same location later. Take off the head gasket. Remove the chain tensioner and guide sprocket. Remove the cylinder block. Tap the cylinder with a plastic mallet, being careful not to bend any cooling fins. If broken rings are suspected, the crankcase opening should be covered first so the rings don't drop inside. Mark the pistons as to location and remove the piston pin circlips. Remove the piston pins with the tool supplied in the special tool kit. After removal, return each pin to the piston it was taken from. Disconnect the wire from the oil pressure switch. Disconnect the neutral switch wire. Remove the starter. Take off the dynamo housing. And take out the starter gears. Using a special tool to hold it, unbolt the rotor. Use an additional special purpose tool and remove the rotor and starter clutch assembly. Remove the Woodruff key, the bronze thrust washer, the starter clutch gear and bearing, and the inner thrust washer. Remove the transmission cover and sprocket spacer. Remove the shift mechanism, detent plate, and spring. Take off the breaker point cover. Hold the engine rotation nut and remove the breaker point cam bolt. Remove the contact breaker plate and the automatic advance assembly. Take off the breaker housing. Take off the clutch cover. Remove the clutch spring bolts, washers, and springs. Remove the clutch pressure plate and clutch pusher. Tilt the engine so the push rod ball bearing will fall out. Remove a few clutch plates so the clutch hub can be held with a special purpose tool, and remove the clutch hub nut with an impact wrench. Pull out the clutch hub and remaining plates. Watch for the thrust washer behind the clutch hub. Remove the kickstarter and kickstarter spring cover. Pull out the spring holder and unhook the spring and take it off. Remove the 5 upper crankcase bolts. Turn the engine over and remove the oil filter cap and element. Take off the bottom engine cover. Take out the oil pump. Remove the 17 10mm bolts and the 8 12mm bolts. Be sure to get all 25, but don't loosen the 4 bolts for the crankshaft bearing cap. Now put in 3 jack bolts and screw them down evenly to separate the crankcase halves. Remove the kickstarter shaft and gear. Remove the transmission shafts and clutch housing. Unbolt the crankshaft main bearing cap. And remove the crankshaft. Remove the shift drum positioning pin. Take out the shift fork spindle and two of the shift forks. Remove the shift fork guide pin and pull out the shift drum and take out the third shift fork. Now for assembly, first install the crankshaft. Align the holes in the bearings with the guide dowels and check that every bearing has a dowel. Make sure the chain is on the crankshaft before the crankshaft is put in. Install the main bearing cap with the arrow pointing forward. The small numbers on the cap show tightening order. Fit the clutch housing to the drive shaft first, and then install the shaft in the crankcase. Make sure the alignment pins and set rings are fully seated in the bearings. Install the output and kickstarter shafts. Install the one-odd shift fork and the shift drum into the lower crankcase. The short end of the fork goes toward the neutral switch end of the drum. That is, push the short end on first. The fork guide pin goes into the center groove. After tightening the pin down, bend up the lock tab on the washer. Rotate the drum to the neutral position and install the shift drum positioning pin. Install the remaining two shift forks. These two are identical. Be sure that the O-ring is in the oil feed passage. Put sealer on the crankcase mating surface. And install the lower crankcase half, positioning the shift forks on the respective gears. Tighten down the 8 large bolts first using the proper torque. Making sure that the O-ring is in place, install the oil pump assembly. Use Loctite on the oil pump bolts. Making sure the oil filter O-ring is in place, install the bottom engine cover. Check that the filter cap O-ring is in place and install the oil filter. Tighten the 5 top case bolts. Turn the kickstarter shaft fully counterclockwise and install the return spring and spring holder. Install the kickshaft cover, taking care not to damage the seal. And put on the kickstarter pedal. Put on the drive shaft thrust washer and clutch hub. Hold the hub with a special tool to tighten the hub nut. Install the clutch plate starting with a friction plate. Put in the push rod ball and pusher. Install the pressure plate, clutch springs, washers, and bolts. Put on the clutch cover. Put on the breaker housing. When installing the timing advance assembly, the pin on the crankshaft must match the slot in the advance assembly. Make sure the advance works freely and install it and the breaker point plate as an assembly. Oil the O-ring to make it slide easily into place and install the starter motor. When putting on the starter gear washers, the thicker thrust washer goes on the inside with the chamfer facing in. To fit the rotor on fully, turn the starter clutch gear around. Apply Loctite to the bolt, hold the rotor with a special purpose tool, and tighten the bolt down. Install the starter gears and shaft. And put on the dynamo housing. Install the shift drum detent plate and spring. The pivot bolt is shouldered, so make sure the plate is on the shoulder and not trapped against the crankcase. Install the shift lever mechanism. Use an oil seal guide to protect the shift pedal seal and put on the transmission cover and drive sprocket spacer. Connect the wires to the neutral switch and to the oil pressure switch. Install the rubber chain guide wheel and put on the cylinder base gasket. Oil the piston pins with clean engine oil and install the pistons complete with rings onto the connecting rods using new piston pin circlips. The arrow on the piston head must point toward the front of the engine. Turn the engine to where all the pistons are at the same level and slip the piston positioning rod under the pistons. Oil the piston rings and rotate them so that the top and bottom ring gaps are at the front and the center ring gap is at the back of the piston. Make sure the two alignment pins are in place in the crankcase. Fit the ring compressor tool onto the pistons and carefully push the cylinder block down over the studs until all the piston rings are well inside the cylinders. Remove the ring compressor and the rods and push the cylinder fully down. Install the chain guide and tensioner sprockets. Make sure that the rubber pieces are in place on the spindles. Install a new head gasket. The side of the gasket with a wider folded over edge goes up. Put the head on over the studs and put on the copper washers and cylinder head nuts. Following the proper sequence, tighten down the cylinder head nuts with the correct torque. Then tighten the two small bolts next to the outer spark plug holes. Install the lifters and shims in their original positions. If no work was done to the valves, no adjustment should be necessary. Next, pull the cam chain up taut so that it doesn't get jammed at the crankshaft sprocket, and turn the engine over until the T mark for cylinders 1 and 4 is aligned with a timing mark on the breaker point housing. The T stands for top dead center. Feed the exhaust camshaft through the cam chain. Align the mark on the exhaust camshaft sprocket with the surface of the head. Pull the cam chain tight and put it on the sprocket at this point. Starting with the next chain pin above the mark on the sprocket, count to the 28th pin in the direction of the intake cam. The 28th pin should be aligned with the arrow and the number 28 on the rubber damper of the intake cam sprocket. Install the camshaft caps, making sure that the caps and all the bushing halves are back in their original locations. The arrow on the cap must point to the front. Gradually tighten the bolts until the caps are seated. Then tighten them with the correct torque, following the tightening order given in small numbers on the top of each cap. Install the top cam chain guide assembly. Check to be sure that the marks on the intake and exhaust sprockets are aligned with the head surface at the same time that pistons 1 and 4 are at top dead center. To adjust chain tension, that is, take up chain slack, loosen the lock nut and bolt on the tensioner housing. A spring in the tensioner will automatically adjust the chain as soon as the bolt is loosened. Turn the engine over one time to make sure slack is taken up evenly, and then tighten the bolt and lock nut. Install the tachometer drive gear. This must always be inserted after the exhaust camshaft is in place to prevent camshaft gear damage. Lubricate the cams and lifters with clean engine oil and bolt on the valve cover, tightening the bolts with the correct torque. Put in the spark plugs. And put on the contact breaker cover. This completes engine assembly.